Well, again, and the Pleiades is one of those common denominators in prehistory and with the flood story. Just as the Pleiades will show up in some verses in the Bible, as in, I think it's in Job and Amos and in the Psalms. But what's interesting about the Pleiades as well is it's also connected as the Seven Sisters and connected to Orion, which is also connected to the flood. And particularly in Native American mythologies, like from the Hopi and others, and from the Kishamaya and from Atlantean mythologies, because they're all kind of connected back as you trace their religions and their history back to the white snake clam that comes out of the island in the Atlantic, is that they have this recollection of 2 or 3, depending on the legend or the religion, stars out of the Pleiades that hits the oceans, that starts the conflagration of catastrophes that leads to the flood event. And then when they have versions of the Babel story in polytheism after the flood, they build this temple at the bottom of the Babel Tower that's dedicated to Enki and whatever other vernacular name of the gods it might be in the other religions, and it's dedicated to both Enki and these 2 stars or asteroids or meteors, whatever they were, that begat the flood. So again, you have this connection that is inexplicable, all coming mostly from a polytheist account that is rarely sort of tried to be analyzed in terms of, okay, does the Bible say anything on that, and is there a correlation there that they're telling obviously the same story but through a different lens? Commonality of that holy mountain. They're known by different names around the world. The Chinese have actually named the 7 mountains as part of their mythology, and so you have a mountain, let's say, that's in Greek mythology, that's Olympus, and of course most people are familiar with Hermon, which not most, but a lot of people connect, and some of the beliefs coming out of Mesopotamia, that is Mount Nippur, which was the Sumerian mountain, the holy congregation. You have Adiops, which was the Mount of Serpents, which was connected to Atlantis, and wherever you go around the world, you have that ideology of this assembly of this holy mountain. And again, I don't think that that's a coincidence, and I don't think it's a coincidence that humans were trying to build pyramids, whether it's Babel, in a tower, on all the while noting that towers, ziggurats, and pyramids were thought of as the same type of structure in the antediluvian epoch and in the early post-diluvian epoch, that they were trying to create these holy mountains because this is where the gods came to meet. And they came from the other dimensions, whether through portals or however the gods move back and forth between the different dimensions, the spirit world and the physical world. But this was a place where they met the kings of the antediluvian epoch, or the ring lords, as it would be known in some more modern traditions. And so these were the Anunnaki. That comes out of the Anunnaki sort of version of it. And so anything that's circular, like a King Arthur's table or a ring lord or a ring, is always from that sort of tradition. And I think it's interesting that they're always trying to copycat or make a false replication of what God has set up. Even though they're fighting for a rebellion and probably being different and away from God and not following his rules, they're always trying to recreate this copycat version, aka Antichrist will come back as a copycat of or will come to us as a copycat of Jesus, just as the false prophet is another copycat, just as the 1,000-year reign is another copycat. So it's very, very strange and odd, and without coincidence, I think that everything is trying to be copied. Just as maybe many people think that pyramids and or Babel was a place where possibly there was going to be a portal made to bring back angels to the post-diluvian epoch to rule over them, just as they did in the antediluvian epoch, or perhaps even to procreate and create more giants after the flood. And if you take Akkadian as it take Babel as it comes out of Akkadian, and their understanding of the Babel event, Akkad translates, or Babel translates out of Akkadian as Bab for a gate or gateway, and El as in God, so either a stargate or a gateway to the gods or a portal. Seems to be a connection there that they're trying to recreate with their false mountains. Well, and Baal in the Mesopotamian traditions is a very, very high up god, and he may even be considered a Satan-like character as well. But I generally place him a touch lower. But it kind of goes back and forth with some of the occultic languages, because what he does is he does something similar to what God does. Baal is he attacks the Leviathan, and I'm trying to think of whether or not in that version it's called Tiamat or Lotan or Yam, or there's many different names for this Leviathan, right? And he breaks the skull in two and divides it into earth and into heaven as part of the controlling of chaos and creating the earth and the sky. And that same type of God is also, with the same type of story, goes with Marduk and with Ra out of the Egyptian pantheon, and China, that would be Pangu, and Indra in the Vedas, for example. They all tell that sort of similar story. So this is a very high up angel if you draw that comparative. So, and typically at the top of the pantheon, right under the parent god, you have an Anki or a Baal type character or an Osiris. So that's kind of how I look at them. Yeah, and then when you go to Freemasonry, they generally use the Egyptian pantheon and allegories, and they look at Osiris as the male god, equivalent with Baal or Zeus or Tammuz, and there's so many of the similar type of names. They're all the same god in all the different pantheons, but what they actually say about Osiris, which I think you could take to the rest of these other gods, was an allegory for Satan, whom they call Lucifer. And so I think you can sort of transpose that through all of the different pantheons around the world, because they're essentially the same religion. The followers of Osiris went to Egypt after Babel, and that is rooted in the followers of Asar, which comes out of Mesopotamia, which again links all of these sort of religions back together as being part of the same type of originating religion, and that this comes out of that whole sun disk symbolism of Ahura Mazda, which was sort of that originating Zoroastrian religion that also moves over to India with the Aryans in about 2300 BC or so to start the Veda religions, which is has amazingly similar names for gods. So when we talk about these different pantheons being the same gods with the same different vernacular names, you can pretty much take that to the bank, I think. Yeah, and it makes sense, because if you have Nimrod staying in Mesopotamia after Babel and setting up the Mesopotamian pantheon, and then you have Mizraim and Ham leaving, and in Freemason records they'll take Hermes with them over to Egypt to start the Egyptian pantheon. You have the two mainstay pantheons in the early post-Diluvian epoch being established that are going to spread these religions around the world. And to me, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing is that, as they document things coming out of secular history, there's a lot of disagreement as to how you establish the reigns and then cross them over to the different civilizations, because there's not a ton of information to do that sort of, triangulation at times. And, again, I think, cutting edge researchers and writers like, Dave Grohl, suggest that and make a very good case for a different chronology in a lot of cases, because they're duplicating many of the dynasties because they had more than one name and more than one title.
Right.
And And so the accuracy isn't always there on the secular side. It's just that everybody accepts their theories as fact, as opposed to sometimes theory tales, as opposed, more like a fairy tale at times. But I might be being a little bit too hard on them. And they readily do that to dismiss the biblical chronology, or it's a design thing to discredit biblical chronology, because right from the beginning, when these mystical religions were set up and were being fed information by these fallen angels who become the gods, they are trying to do a number of things. And what they're trying to do with their science and the history and the seven sacred sciences is, to lead people away from God and to discredit God for everything, and to dismiss God and to slander God. So it makes sense that history through seculars is going to be doing those four principles that they've always done from the beginning, and also designed to honor the pantheon of the gods. So again, I tend to use a lot of secular dates when I do my research, understanding that they're not always lining up with the biblical date, but that doesn't mean I am 100% convinced that science isn't just projecting another theory or a misdirection.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, there are key sets of these demons or fallen angels, whomever that they're challenging, and there doesn't seem to be an endless number of these ones. So it wouldn't surprise me that they're channeling the same names. And certainly Helen Blavatsky names a couple of her spirit guides that she's channeling. And I haven't seen too much repetition of the names, but it would not surprise me that because they're all driving for the same goal, that it would be the same entities that they're talking to. But if you talk to whether or not it's the adepts of Buddhism today and over in Tibet, they're talking to the celestial masters. If you talk to or read about what the Rosicrucians do at their higher levels, they are talking to the Great White Brotherhood and the Celestial Brotherhood that apparently is running all the things and still giving them information. It's a constant in all of these religions. Whether or not they're the same individuals, one probably presumes they are. But I can't say I have explicit information that says that they're the same two or three or the same half dozen or the same 70, whatever that number is. Derek was talking about, and if I heard you correctly, about Gog and Magog and being up in sort of the northwest Turkey area, which is the Scythian area, and a special mountain that's up there. Well, that's where the Aryans come from, and out of Tartarus, as they say that they escaped from, and in the mythologies that sort of go along with them. And these are the same ones, and you mentioned the Mitanni dynasty. It's the Aryan Marianu that start the Mitanni dynasty, which is one of the powerful dynasties of Nephilim in the post-Diluvian epoch, and they have gods in there like Indra and Mithra and Varuna, because it's the Aryans that are going to take that religion to the Vedas in about, I think, 2300 BC, if my memory serves me right, and they're called the noble ones, the pure ones, the enlightened ones, and so when you think about all of that, you understand that it makes sense that information would be starting to come to the West from Eastern mysticism and be made aware and start this mythos again about something in Antarctica, because again, there's a lot of speculation in the occult circles that Antarctica is actually the continent of Atlantis, that somehow during one of the catastrophes, the Earth crust slips and it slides down to the bottom of the Earth. Whether or not that's true or not, that's just sort of going down a path of some of their legends. But it goes to that idea that there is something being hidden, something kept secret, something that's going to be revealed at a certain point in time when the people are ready for this knowledge, that I think is going to be part of that great deception and delusion of the end time. So you see all of it coming full circle, and that's why it's just sort of swished around and around and around in all the entertainment, in all of the ancient sort of classical writings that come down through history that mysteriously are kept alive and are all polytheist. And that it matches up again perfectly with what we know about sort of prophecy and what's likely coming to in our direction. I was also, noting that the Mitanni are also connected to, in my mind, when you're talking about Hurrian, that they are definitely connected and part of that society. And there's a few different sort of nations that are set up, but Hurrian and Horite are considered to be probably the same type of people. And these are, again, a mysterious Nephilim people in the land of Seir that's also likely is who the descendants of Esau married into, because Seir is a Horite, and these are hairy cave-dwelling giants. Again, hairy is pretty normal for a Nephilim description, and so again they just reach right down through our history, biblical and otherwise, in ways that people haven't really sort of thought about before. And, seemingly Petra, what we see of Petra is just the superficial top level, and it's got the major part of Petra is actually underground as well. So, I'm not sure where you're going with it, Chad, but, there's certainly a lot of archaeology I think that's not all that well known that suggests that there was some, significant underground cities that were built. And again, what I find significant about that, if you take the Horites who are associated with the Hurrians, and you take that back to Kori, they're actually cave dwellers, right? And is that what they're talking about? Is that Nephilim were builders of great underground cities? I'm just speculating and connecting some dots, but it's just interesting. There's a couple things going on. I mean, first of all, just so that people understand out there, there's obviously ones where people have bound heads to emulate something, and I would suggest emulate their demigods, which would have been the giants and the Nephilim, because they were a serpentine-looking figure that had these elongated skulls. But the thing is with the human ones, is what you can't do with that by binding is create a bigger cranial capacity.
Right,
so you
true.
have the second kind that Chad is talking about, and a lot of them don't have the normal human suture, and that's probably, and most people conclude, are from the giants. And then the second thing is that there is, in the occult side, is that they were doing this pressure on the brain to manipulate the brain to increase their mental faculties, whether that's true or not, or actually it worked. So you have this idea of emulating their demigods and probably their gods, because the gods had that serpentine look in a lot of cases as well as perhaps trying to distinguish themselves as a priest class or a noble class above the regular mundane. So I think all of this is all going on, but it goes to the root of these polytheist societies that have these demigods that aren't fully human, and you've got these gods that go back to seraphim angels. Smithson was one of the youngest members to join the Royal Society. He was educated at Oxford, and so right out of university he becomes part of the Royal Society. He's also a Freemason. And so when he leaves this money, it's going to be taken over to be brought over by a couple of American presidents who are both Freemasons, and so this whole thing is answerable and funded back to the Royal Society. So if people think that this is an organization that is embedded in a vacuum of secular objectivity, it's rooted in mysticism, because the Royal Society is set up by Freemasons and Rosicrucians to do those four principles that I was talking about earlier, is to lead people away from God, and to discredit God for everything, and to slander God, and to honor the pantheon of gods. So why anybody would think that the Smithsonian would give us an objective perspective and coincidentally lose somehow every part and anything that suggests otherwise that ever goes back to them, is just not a surprise.
Yeah, especially, like I said, all the skeletons and all that. I mean, they found a 18-foot skeleton here in Seymour, Texas, which is right down close to San Antonio. And then we got the rock wall over here in Rockwall, Texas, which is literally 10 minutes down the road from me. that, basically they were pulling out artifacts. They were trying to say, well, this is, who was it? Scott Wolf or whatever on America Unearthed, the History Channel, was trying to say that this was all a naturally occurring geological thing. Well, first of all, this guy's not even a geologist, okay? If you really want to get me started, the guy's not even a geologist. He says he has an honorary degree from some college. Well, they've gone and looked into that. That college has never, ever given out any kind of honorary degrees, period. And so, I mean, his whole argument is all nonsense. And, not only were they pulling out artifacts, they pulled out a skull to an 18-foot giant out of there as well. In fact, part of the wall used to be completely unearthed. Well, they eventually filled that in with what they call Lake Ray Hubbard now. Part of the wall is actually under the lake. That was the only way they could hide it, was to fill it in with the lake. And not only that, but 150 miles away from here, there's another place called Milano, Texas, where there's another wall that they said is even bigger than the Great Wall of China, and it's buried underneath, under the ground.
Yeah, and it should also be noted that people should have a look at the Smithsonian logo. It's that creepy sun-worshipping logo, and it's a very similar logo to that of the Jesuits. Right. And again, it's this cave thing and this subterranean thing that sort of keeps sort of resurging all of the time. And I know you'll appreciate this, Chad. I mean, just think of the Temple of Pan over in the Bashan area, where Jesus went to preached and announced Peter to be the rock of the church. I mean, that was over a cave that was thought to lead to the underworld, right? And was known as the Rock of the Gods. I mean, this whole idea of underworld and gods is another one of these consistencies that just don't seem to go away. And it doesn't matter seemingly where you go around the world. Like you have the Nagas that were, again, the serpentine type race that were considered the gods and symbolized the netherworld and the underworld. And again, you have this serpentine imagery coming back, and you have these Naga priests, which are very similar to the Sabeti or the Shebtiu and the Knuckles and all the different seven sages, the rishis out of India, all telling a very similar story, but also doing these unusual cities and things that have subterranean aspects to them or that go deep into mountains. It's very, very strange and interesting. And if you leave it just as coincidence and don't make the connections, I think we lose the story. And I think we need to dig further into as to why they were building these types of facilities.
Yeah, and the Nagas, I mean, that's some amazing stuff when you start getting into all that. I know that you've recently been doing a lot of research into the dragons over there in India and China. You want to talk a little bit about that, Gary?
Sure, we can. And as we talked about, is that it's the Aryans that are going to carry this belief system and this religion into India, and they're going to found Jainism and Hinduism, which becomes Buddhism, and then the Chinese religion goes back to the Indian religion and is actually centered on that. And this whole idea of the dragons and the dragon creators go back to the belief system of the Nagas and that pantheon that they believe in. And just as that's the same pantheon that is exported down the road over to Japan and floods all of Southeast Asia. And that's why you have this consistency of these dragons and these consistency of the Nagas. And Knuckles were the same thing over in the Quiché Maya as they're recorded over there. So, and these Nagas and there's two sets of Nagas, just as there's two sets of the Sabeti or the Apicals. I can't get that word out right now. We were talking about it earlier in the show. Apikalu, yeah, they're the same types of beings where you have seven major angels, as similar to what Enoch will talk about the book of, that is giving all of this information to civilize the civilizations around the world, whether it's writing and other knowledge, agricultural stuff, all the stuff that you need to build a civilization. And they also create a priesthood, and a priesthood of Nagas in some parts of India, or the Brahmins, as the name comes out of the Aryans, and they're all going to have the same name. So whether or not you're talking about the followers of Horus, or the companions of Horus, or the Nakals, or the Nagas, or the Tengu, these are all the same type of snake brotherhoods, and there's two classes. There is a god class, like a god like the Thoth god, wisdom god of Egypt, which is part of that companions of Horus organization of religion and developing of the knowledge. And you have the male one, or the priests that follow after, and they all have a tradition of these rishis and nagas somehow surviving, and generally there's 7 of them that survive the flood narrative in these occult and polytheist religions to carry this antediluvian knowledge forward to civilize the earth afterwards. Just an amazing amount of commonality. And these Nagas, as being the god ones, as opposed to the demigods, priests, or just human priests, they were considered wise beings from heaven. Okay, they were also considered to be shapeshifters, and they can also take human form. They were lords of the underworld, again, as what I mentioned earlier. And a Naga, best represented and transliterated down, is the cobra. And so you have Naga going back to a specific type of snake, as opposed to Sarpa, which would be snakes in general. So the Nagas were this cobra type look. And again, we have this cobra type look in the Egyptian pantheon. And the pharaohs, the headdress that they would wear would represent sort of those wings, that not wings, but that dressing around a cobra's head. Mm-hmm. And again, I just don't find that this is coincidental, because when we get over to, let's say, the Quiché and Central American and North American cultures, we have these gods that are the feathered and the plumed serpents, and we have the thunderbird gods. And so what we have is this sort of this serpent imagery of these gods with wings and with feathers, and I think they're talking about all of the same. But what's really kind of unique, as with the Anunnaki, is that there's also these bird-like beings, which are more akin to the Tengu out of Japan and out of China. So there seems to be a couple of variations, or they just have this changeling sort of capability. But again, it all goes back to the same seraphim type of powerful gods that were around in the antediluvian epoch. And they all spawn both the priest class, as in the Brahmins in India, and or Taoism, as it comes out of the Chinese, and a military and noble class of rulers. Again, this is very common, and if you look at any of the infrastructure around the world of the dynasties, they have the god that they worship up top, the pantheon of gods. They have their representative, the divine representative pharaoh or king or emperor, and then they have this organizational structure of mysticism, that's the religion, and the developing of magic and the occult and the sciences. And that goes all the way back into prehistory. And if you understand that when we're talking about prehistory and they're talking about wizards as being the priest class, you understand where that allegory fits in on some of the fairy tales and the entertainment where it comes down. Just as the Magi, where Magic comes from, are an extension of the priest class and the name that they accept for what they're developing in terms of the sciences with Nimrod after Babel. That was a rant, sorry.
No, absolutely. It was fascinating stuff.
I just realized I was going on for a very long period of time, and maybe I should let some people in here. And
you can keep going. It's fascinating.
Was there any areas in there that you wanted me to cover off a little bit more in detail, or?
Oh, I mean, you go wherever you want to go with this. I mean, that's the thing, is that I know you've done a lot of research into the whole thing about the dragons and the connections there between all the different dots and stuff.
Yeah, because again, if you get into the creation gods of most of these well, let's just say all of them for sake of simplicity, is that these are serpent gods and or dragon gods that are involved in polytheist creationism. And in there you have the various Leviathans and Rahabs and Yams and Tiamets of the world. They're all talking about the same type of god. Just as you get into the Asgard and Norse mythology. I mean, again, they have the same type of Leviathan, and they call it Midgardamar, and that's where when that animal is destroyed and is separated, as in all of the stories that we talked about earlier, that's where Middle Earth comes from. So when I talk about that, these fairy tales are telling this history of polytheism, you just have to understand the language that they're talking about. And what's also interesting as we go a little bit deeper in it is that as you get into, let's say, Cambodia, and again they have the same understanding of the Nagas, and they look at them as reptilian beings who at one time possessed an empire in the Pacific Ocean, ruled over by King Kaluya. But at some point in time, that was destroyed, and they settled in India, where the Cambodians eventually get their religion from. And again, that goes back to that antediluvian sort of epoch and the flood and the cataclysmic changes and how many different types of civilizations were there? Was there one, or was there as many as 9, as what occultism will talk about? And so the 7-headed Nagas that are depicted at Angkor Wat represent, in their belief system, 7 different races of these Nagas. So 7 different kinds of them. So they're suggesting there are some different kinds of these Nagas, whatever that means. I have not discovered what that means, but you just can't seem to go anywhere in the world and not see this seraphim, serpentine angel with wings imagery that's part of the gods. Just as you have the gods being depicted as serpents in Mesopotamia, and in a lot of cases even the ones on Mount Olympus were originally depicted as serpents. And that makes sense too, because Enki is considered the wisdom god and the serpent god, right? Well, and that's the whole idea, is to get the information out, and it's so wonderful to have a person like Derek on the show who is, very, very familiar with Mesopotamian history and other history, to be able to build on these things and put it together with more details that sort of make sense for the people. Because a lot of times at the shows you get a superficial aspect, but not enough information to properly connect those dots, and more information so that people know that we're just not winging this and we're just not making it up as we go. Well, and I appreciate that. And, as we were just talking about some of the Chinese and the Indian, and let's include the Japanese. So you have a Li family that's out of the China bloodlines, and you have the Yamamoto bloodline coming out of Japan. And I'm still trying to wade through all of the different doorways through the basic bloodlines in India, but it's important to understand this, how it happened in prehistory, because it all has a relevance for prophecy. So that when we talk about the metallic empire that Daniel is talking about in the end time, that the descendants of these empires are going to not only mix with the offspring of humans, so it's going to be iron and clay, with clay being, I think, representing the humans, and the metals representing the dynasties, but there's also kings from around the world. Like we have a 10-nation empire, and they're referred to as the kings of the East in the Revelation. And I think we need to understand that there's not just Western families and bloodlines that are going to make up these kings. This is going to be a worldwide empire represented by all of these ancient bloodlines that are still existing, and perhaps some human bloodlines as well. Yes. Yeah, and they're wanting to have that new Atlantis, that kingdom that was reigning in the antediluvian epoch. That's why Francis Bacon, in his book, The New Atlantis, called it the New Atlantis for the end time. And it'll have the mystical religions with the ruling bloodlines of the Nephilim, or a new Nephilim, because they're always trying to create new Nephilim, and the old gods. And then coming out of the abyss are the fallen angels and these scorpion-like little beasts, right? And what's interesting about those scorpion beasts, again, if you understand what's going on in prehistory, you have some documentation, and particularly in a couple of old Mesopotamian documents about these scorpion gods, and one is the Enuma Elish as one example, and the other one was I think it's out of the it's Dubar tablets that Smith had discovered, and what it's talking about is these scorpion beasts. And, they were locusts, and they had the body of a scorpion. I'll give a description. They looked like horses prepared for battle, just as it's talking about in Revelation. And so they had, they're known as Akrab Buamalu and Gerta Bilu. Two different names, different languages, basically what's coming out of, and also part of the Epic of Gilgamesh as well. And they had they're very large beings with the head and the torso and the arms of a man, but the body of a scorpion with avian or bird legs and wings, and they launched powerful destructive weaponry as some sort of arrow from bows, and they also had a stinger in their tail that it was a venomous stinger that they could sting people with. And it is amazing that is an absolute description of these scorpion things that come out with the fallen angels. And what they were actually sort of like a military and a guard associate with the gods, as they were described in these ancient epics. And what's also interesting is that if you take the word scorpion back to Hebrew, as it comes up a few times in the Old Testament, it's actually spelled AQRAB, number 6137, as what a scorpion is. So again, you get this correlation that is coming together about what the end time is going to look like. And all of this stuff that seems so fantastic out of prehistory is going to burst onto the world stage in a very quick manner, and in a way that is going to overwhelm people and deceive them in a way that they could not have imagined, and thus they're going to buy the lie. They're going to believe the lie.
Yeah, and that's the thing is you get a lot of Christians that they that's the biggest thing that they always ask is, why do we need to know this? What's the importance?
Yeah. And, I know you like to talk about CERN, and I don't know whether we've talked, about where CERN comes from. But, if you do some research into polytheism, you understand there's two gods that are specifically named CERN. One is Cernunnos, which is a Druid god, and its counterpart, which is the same god, which is CERN out of the Etruscan pantheon. And this is a god that is described exactly the same way as the Pan god is. And they name this thing after these two gods, after the Pan god. And as we've talked about, I'm sure you've talked about many times, is people think that the CERN is trying to find a way to get into the abyss to release Azazel, who the Pan god is associated with.
Yeah, and plus,
it's all hidden in plain sight.
Well, not only that, but look at where CERN is located at. What's smack dab right in the middle of the circle? That's where the Temple of Apollo was, and that's where they believe that the abyss is located directly underneath that. So that's the thing is, it's all done for a reason. It's not just happenstance or just luck or whatever you want to call it. They put that there for a very specific purpose, and it's there in a specific place for a specific reason.
Yeah, and again, when we talk about Apollyon, Apollo is, and there's not very much writing on this, but I mean, most think of Apollo as a sun god, but he's also, a god of the underworld as well, and there's a temple that's actually dedicated to Apollyon. Which was his other name, and he was known there as the Greek god of death and pestilence, as well as the sun god. Put that alongside with what Jesus said about signs for the end times, that it's going to be like the days of Noah, and nothing new is under the sun. Then it's more than just people were getting buried and before the end came. It's the whole ideology of what happened before the flood and what's been going on over and over and over. Babel was just, another rebellion, just as the end time is going to be the final rebellion. This has happened over and over and over throughout our history. Yeah, exactly. And if we are prepared, we can alert other people. And even if they're not ready to accept it, the seed's been planted, and then they'll have to make a choice at that time. But at least they'll have a chance to make the right decision. At least you'll have, the first death and either be raised into heaven, or you'll have a second death and you won't burn forever. I mean, the first two choices are better, but one would be, saying let's think about this and let's go with the one who's going to promote us to immortality forever and choose God.
Amen.
But it's going to be a difficult choice because it's not going to seem quite that simple in the heat of battle. And that's why if you always know what you're going to do when before you get into those situations, the decision becomes much easier than trying to make a panic-stricken, hurried decision. Because this will happen very quickly as it all comes to pass.
And we have to prepare ourselves for that.
And if this is the generation, and I think we're in the zone of all of this starting to unfold, then we don't have the easy path. So we'll have a more difficult path, but one presumes with what we're going to do, greater rewards will come of it. But again, I think that's why we're told not to want to look forward to the end times, because it's going to be a very terrible short period of time. But then after that, obviously, it leads into eternity. Starting with the 1,000-year millennium and then off into eternity.
Do you find, Gary, that right now you feel a heavy heart?
We can only do what we can do and do it to the best of our ability. But I believe that, again, because I like to go back to what Jesus said, and I have a different take on things at times than other people, particularly on prophecy. I believe that the 144,000 are going to be the ones that are going to preach the Bible to the people in the end time, that Jesus talks about the gospel being preached around the world. And it's only for a short period of time, but I think that's part of trying to get the message out for the people of the end time. So nobody can say that they weren't properly warned in the end time. Because it is going to happen very quickly with a whole bunch of different things that are just going to overwhelm people. So the second thing is actually, two things or three things. So the first thing is that I do believe that we're in the fig tree generation. And so then it gets to be how long is a generation, and what triggers the fig tree generation. Was it Israel becoming a nation in 1947, or was it taking of Jerusalem in 1967, and is a generation 70 years or slightly longer or estimated around that? Either way, if we're in the fig tree generation, that is the big event. And so things will come when they come. And the second thing would be is as I watch, and it doesn't matter who's in power, is we have this continual march towards global government and being afraid of wiping ourselves from the face of the earth. And there's more and more talk that comes along with that, with religions talking more and trying to find ways to bridge that. So I would say those are the things that have me really thinking that we are where we are as that couples up with the technology that we have in place, which would have to be a great technology based on what I think they had in the antediluvian epoch. So those are the major sort of things that I see that are happening. And even though it seems to be taking a long time to put together, we have to understand that until the restrainer is removed, like the end time can't happen. So everything is preparation, and then things will happen very, very quickly. And I think they'll happen very, very quickly after we hit that trigger with the aid of catastrophes. So does that answer the question that you're talking about, or were you looking for something more specific that I could point towards? Serpents, that is very, very important. And one of the things that I always appreciate is how the Bible doesn't work with in coincidence, and how it links things that people don't tend to look for. So, in Luke 10, it talks, Jesus is talking, and he's talking about seeing Satan as he fell from heaven, which is obviously referring to Isaiah 12 about Lucifer as it comes out in the King James Bible. But what he also says is I also give you, power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy. Right? And he's talking about these imageries that we've been talking about the whole show, as he talked about beholding Satan falling from heaven. That is not a coincidence. Again, kind of the point is that if you don't understand prehistory, and if you don't understand that the giants were real, as it's talked about in Genesis 6, and as they come up after the flood again, you lose a significant ability to interpret and understand what the Bible is talking about all the way through, and also what's going to happen in the end time. It is one of those sort of decoding secrets that you need to have. It's the right lens to view Israelite history, our history, the history of the world, and what's going to happen in the end time. And without that, you're kind of half blind, and you will be surprised. So learn about this and dig deeper into it. That would be my encouragement for people, because it really is to continue to mix metaphors, the Rosetta Stone to the Bible. Yes, and again, I don't look at that as, and again, not all translations have it quite that way, but it might say mighty ones, or it might say other sort of versions, but they are talking about the same type of entities, or at least the bloodlines, and who knows, maybe full-grown giants, we don't know. Excerpt of every chapter on that website to give you a good feel for the book. You can also follow me on Gary Wayne on Facebook, and 2 Genesis 6 conspiracy pages. There's been somebody has set up a Gary Wayne group, Genesis 6 conspiracy, and I'll be posting and commenting in there regularly. And you can also follow me on Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63. And if you get a hold of me with a question or a comment you want to come back on, I will get back to you on that. It may take me a day or two, but I will get back to you on that. And as far as ordering the book, you can order signed copies from me off my website. It's also available through BarnesandNoble.com and Amazon.com and Amazon.ca and around the world, and you can connect to those off my website or go directly to them. It's also available in Kindle form, which you can also connect to off my website. It's also available on all online retailers, and it is available through pretty much any retailer, even if they don't have it on the shelf and you want to support your local bookstore or local Christian bookstore. It's distributed through Bookmasters, so if you tell them Genesis 6 Conspiracy by Gary Wayne through Bookmasters, they can bring it in for you. Anything on that, and is there a correlation there that they're telling obviously the same story but through a different lens? Commonality of that holy mountain. They're known by different names around the world. You know, the Chinese have actually named the 7 mountains as part of their mythology, and so you have a mountain, let's say, that's in Greek mythology, that's Olympus, and of course most people are familiar with Hermon, which well, not most, but a lot of people connect, and some of the beliefs coming out of Mesopotamia, that is Mount Nippur, which was the Sumerian mountain, the holy congregation. You have Adiops, which was the Mount of Serpents, which was connected to Atlantis, and wherever you go around the world, you have that ideology of this assembly of this holy mountain. And again, I don't think that that's a coincidence, and I don't think it's a coincidence that humans were trying to build pyramids, whether it's Babel in a tower, on all the while noting that towers, ziggurats, and pyramids were thought of as the same type of structure in the antediluvian epoch and in the early post-diluvian epoch, that they were trying to create these holy mountains because this is where the gods came to meet. And they came from the other dimensions, whether through portals or however the gods move back and forth between the different dimensions, the spirit world and the physical world. But this was a place where they met the kings of the antediluvian epoch, or the ring lords, as it would be known in some more modern traditions. And so these were the Anunnaki. That comes out of the Anunnaki sort of version of it. And so anything that's circular, like a King Arthur's table or a ring lord, a Satan-like character as well. But I generally place them a touch lower. But it kind of goes back and forth with some of the occultic languages, because what he does is he does something similar to what God does. Baal is he attacks the Leviathan, and I'm trying to think of whether or not in that version it's called Tiamat or Lotan or Yam, or there's many different names for this Leviathan, right? And he breaks the skull in two and divides it into earth and into heaven as part of the controlling of chaos and creating the earth and the sky. And that same type of God is also, with the same type of story, goes with Marduk and with Ra out of the Egyptian pantheon, and China, that would be Pangu, and Indra in the Vedas, for example. They all tell that sort of similar story. So this is a very high up angel if you draw that comparative. So, and typically at the top of the pantheon, right under the parent god, you have an Anki or a Baal type character or an Osiris. So that's kind of how I look at them. Yeah, and then when you go to Freemasonry, they generally use the Egyptian pantheon and allegories, and they look at Osiris as the male god, equivalent with Baal or Zeus or Tammuz, and there's so many of the similar type of names. They're all the same god in all the different pantheons, but what they actually say about Osiris, which I think you could take to the rest of these other gods, was an allegory for Satan, whom they call Lucifer. And so I think you can sort of or a ring is always from that sort of tradition. And I think it's interesting that they're always trying to copycat or make a false replication of what God has set up. Even though they're fighting for a rebellion and probably being different and away from God and not following his rules, they're always trying to recreate this copycat version, aka Antichrist will come back as a copycat of or will come to us as a copycat of Jesus, just as the false prophet is another copycat, just as the 1,000-year reign is another copycat. So it's very, very strange and odd And without coincidence, I think that everything is trying to be copied. Just as maybe many people think that pyramids and or Babel was a place where possibly there was going to be a portal made to bring back angels to the post-Diluvian epoch to rule over them, just as they did in the antediluvian epoch, or perhaps even to, procreate and create more giants after the flood. And if you take take Babel as it comes out of Akkadian, and their understanding of the Babel event, Babel translates out of Akkadian as Bab for a gate or gateway, and El as in God, so either a stargate or a gateway to the gods or a portal. Seems to be a connection there that they're trying to recreate with their false mountains. Well, and Baal in the Mesopotamian traditions is a very, very high up god, and he may even be considered, pose that through all of the different pantheons around the world, because they're essentially the same religion. The followers of Osiris went to Egypt after Babel, and that is rooted in the followers of Asar, which comes out of Mesopotamia, which again links all of these sort of religions back together as being part of the same type of originating religion, and that this comes out of that whole sun disk symbolism of Ahura Mazda, which was sort of that originating Zoroastrian religion that also moves over to India with the Aryans in about 2300 BC or so to start the Veda religions, which is has amazingly similar names for gods. So when we talk about these different pantheons being the same gods with the same different vernacular names, you can pretty much take that to the bank, I think. Yeah. And it makes sense, because if you have Nimrod staying in Mesopotamia after Babel and setting up the Mesopotamian pantheon, and then you have Mizraim and Ham leaving, and in Freemason records they'll take Hermes with them over to Egypt to start the Egyptian pantheon. You have the two mainstay pantheons in the early post-Diluvian epoch being established that are going to spread these religions around the world. And to me, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing is that, as they document things coming out of secular history, there's a lot of disagreement. Well, again, and the Pleiades is one of those common denominators in prehistory and with the flood story. Just as the Pleiades will show up in some verses in the Bible, as in, I think it's in Job and Amos and in the Psalms. But what's interesting about the Pleiades as well is it's also connected as the Seven Sisters and connected to Orion, which is also connected to the flood. And particularly in Native American mythologies, like from the Hopi and others, and from the Kishamaya and from Atlantean mythologies, because they're all kind of connected back as you trace their religions and their history back to the white snake clam that comes out of the island in the Atlantic, is that they have this recollection of 2 or 3, depending on the legend or the religion, stars out of the Pleiades that hits the oceans, that starts the conflagration of catastrophes that leads to the flood event. And then when they have versions of the Babel story in polytheism after the flood, they build this temple at the bottom of the Babel Tower that's dedicated to Enki and whatever other vernacular name of the gods it might be in the other religions, and it's dedicated to both Enki and these 2 stars or asteroids or meteors, whatever they were, that begat the flood. So again, you have this connection that is inexplicable, all coming mostly from a polytheist account that is rarely sort of tried to be analyzed in terms of, okay, does the Bible say anything